Well, the tentacles of Jeffrey Epstein go wide and they go deep, and they reach right into Jamie Dimon, who is the JPMorgan chief executive. Jamie Dimon, he's going to be interviewed under oath now in these Jeffrey Epstein lawsuits. Investigative journalist Whitney Webb has been covering this story from the very beginning. She's written a great new piece called The Rise of Jamie Dimon on her website, unlimitedhangout.com. I encourage all of you to read it. So, what is this connection, this Jeffrey Epstein connection, and how big and wide does this go beyond Jeffrey Epstein? Investigative journalist Whitney Webb joins us now. Welcome back to the show, Whitney. Great to see you.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me back on.
My pleasure. And you've written, so first, I just want to start there at the beginning, sort of about Jamie Dimon, and then we can get into the broader implications of this and how wide this goes. Jamie Dimon is going to be interviewed in Jeffrey Epstein lawsuits, and a lot of people hoping that we'll learn a lot more about this relationship and Jeffrey Epstein and these deeper connections here. So first, for our viewers who don't understand or have any idea why Jamie Dimon would be involved in this, who is Jamie Dimon and how is he involved with Jeffrey Epstein?
Okay, so for people that don't know, Jamie Dimon is the CEO, and he has been since the early 2000s of JPMorgan Chase, one of the biggest banks on Wall Street. And he's considered one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, Wall Street banker today. And he's currently in the news in relation to the Epstein case because there is a lawsuit being brought from the U.S. Virgin Islands, which argues that Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking activity was directly enabled by Jeffrey Epstein, particularly by two JPMorgan executives. The main focus of the case being Jess Stahli, who left the bank in around 2013. But they've alleged that lawyers for the USVI have alleged that Jamie Dimon himself was aware of the situation and directly enabled Epstein, and the JPMorgan Chase has denied this and is trying to make Stahli, essentially the scapegoat for the whole case and trying to keep Dimon away from it. But he's going to be Dimon is going to be forced to offer a statement or potentially be interviewed under oath. So it remains to be seen what's going on there and how deep those questions will go. Obviously, the U.S. Virgin Islands is making a very praiseworthy effort to hold this particular bank to account. And let's keep in mind that a few days after this this exact lawsuit was filed, the Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Denise George, was fired. And so a lot of people see a connection between that firing and her filing of this particular lawsuit, which has been allowed to advance in U.S. courts despite JPMorgan and Chase trying to prevent that from happening. So, but what hasn't been said, right?
No, I just want to ask you, so we'll get to the what hasn't been said part, but just to be clear, you say that JPMorgan Chase was enabling this sex trafficking by Epstein. That's what the lawsuit alleges. Can you be specific? How were they enabling that?
So someone that was actually at the hearing sent me a leaked recording of it, and there was a lot that happened there that did not make it into mainstream press reports. One of them being that it was very clear from JPMorgan internal reports that Jeffrey Epstein allegedly was having a financial advisory firm at the time, but his accounts at JPMorgan reflect no activity that would have potentially involved any sort of clients. It was very odd financial activity, and he was making payments to known victims of his sex trafficking scheme, and he was using JPMorgan to give significant loans to Jean-Luc Brunel's MC2 business. And Jean-Luc Brunel, of course, is a major part of the Epstein case, particularly as it relates to the sex trafficking activities. And he, of course, was arrested in Paris and died under the same circumstances as Epstein did in a jail cell in what was ruled a suicide, but is very unlikely to actually have been the case. And JPMorgan is alleged to have directly facilitated that because given their own internal admissions about the oddities of the report, the oddities of Epstein's account, something should have been done long ago and nothing was done. And they allege, the USVI say that they'll be providing documents that show that this went far beyond Jess Stahli and actually go straight to the executive suite, meaning Jamie Dimon.
Wow. So what's not being said? I'm sorry to interrupt you earlier, but I want to know how this enabling process, it's unbelievable and much deeper than I even anticipated.
Yeah. So basically, what's not being said is that the reason Jamie Dimon is head of JPMorgan Chase at all really has to do intimately with the circle around Leslie Wexner, particularly his right hand man, John W. Kessler. So, Leslie Wexner has two hands. And as someone who's researched him a lot, essentially you have on the one hand Kessler and you had on the other hand Epstein. That's how close these particular associates of him were. And Kessler, in addition with a particular family from Chicago that's part of the same network I write about in the book that has a lot of connections to Wexner, the Crown family of Chicago, were essentially the people that orchestrated Jamie Dimon's installment as CEO of Bank One in the year 2000. So the Crown family essentially orchestrated the ouster of the previous CEO, and then Kessler and this sort of Wexner-centric team on the board of Bank One, along with the Crown family and their associates, came together and chose Jamie Dimon to be the CEO of Bank One. And Bank One, a few years later, was acquired by JPMorgan Chase, and Jamie Dimon was put in charge of that. So essentially what my article shows is what Bank One was before that point, and going way, 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 way back, very Wexner-centric, allegedly involved in all sorts of criminal activity, including money laundering, arms deals, and very shady financial connections with Leslie Wexner's The Limited, among other things. And on top of that, if you look at Dimon's history before he became CEO of Bank One, he was building Citigroup with his mentor, Sandy Weil, and that began with a company they acquired in 1985 called Commercial Credit Corporation. And as I note in the article, Commercial Credit Corporation and its parent company, Control Data Corp, are essentially espionage cutouts tied to these networks of intelligence and organized crime that were working together to essentially make money, but also were subverting U.S. National security by engaging in illicit technology transfers. They were spying on the U.S. military, and they were, essentially shipping off a bunch of sensitive U.S. military and other types of technology to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, in the same networks that include people like Robert Maxwell and his confidant and lawyer, the father of current U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Samuel Pisar. And a lot of these people are intimately connected. As I note in the article, a lot of it seemed to have been centered around this particular think tank called the American Committee for U.S.-Soviet Relations, which had a lot of these organized crime figures, people close to the Crown family, like Paul Zifrin, people close to Robert Maxwell, people like Armand Hammer, whose father was a Soviet spy and tried to buy a bank where a lot of U.S. congressmen had accounts for the purposes of financially blackmailing them. These guys were extremely aggressive in promoting tech transfers to the Soviet Union for the purpose of essentially equalizing the playing field in a sense. But as Samuel Pisar told Congress in the early 70s, it was to create a single unified world economy where you have private Western capitalist enterprises merging their activities with communist state-run enterprises and ostensible adversary nations, with the goal of creating a global a single, economic economy. It's very disturbing stuff. And this company that was at the center of that is now Citigroup.
Wow. So a unipolar banking system, a unipolar order run by these unelected people running the world economy. That's basically, they laid this out in the 1970s.
So Pisar essentially said the nation state's becoming irrelevant because it's all about private enterprises in the West merging and intermingling with communist state-run enterprises in Russia and China and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the major facilitators of this were, people like Robert Maxwell, people like Samuel Pisar, and a lot of these other businessmen in this particular nexus that involve a lot of organized crime and intelligence connections. Because essentially, at the end of the day, they want to be, whoever controls the money controls the world, right? So if you build a single unified world economy, which you uniquely control, then you control everything.
And as you've pointed out in your piece and otherwise, that they've been at the heart of each of these financial collapses, right? They've been there right in the middle of it.
Yeah, a lot of them. Yeah. So, for example, in the 1980s, there was a major crisis with savings and loans, and you had an insane amount of collapses of savings and loans institutions throughout the United States. You had the situation with Michael Milken and the junk bonds, Drexel, Burnham, Lambert. All of these are very much tied to intelligence, organized crime connections. I detail a lot of this in my book, but there's, the work of Pete Bruton, formerly of the Houston Post, and a lot of reporting over the decades on that. And essentially what resulted, what came out of that is that, the federal government and the bodies responsible for handling these types of situations would take the collapsed institutions, bundle them together, and sell their assets off to stable financial institutions. And so, an entity like Bank One, which is very close to, Leslie Wexner, was absorbing a lot of these. And a lot of these banks today, these mega banks, these so-called too big to fail banks, just consolidating. So you have over time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of banks all over the country in the U.S. And it's slowly becoming fewer and fewer as banks collapse. And a lot of these banks collapse are engineered. And so this particular article I have up right now about the rise of Jamie Dimon is really just part of a series, because I also have evidence that in 2008, that was, the collapse of Bear Stearns. Jeffrey Epstein essentially was if you want to see Bear Stearns as a giant bubble, the pin that popped Bear Stearns was Jeffrey Epstein. And then he goes, and Bear Stearns gets folded into JPMorgan, and then he starts banking with JPMorgan, and all the stuff at the center of the lawsuit that we talked about earlier, are based in that period. But it's a big benefit. The 2008 economic crisis was very beneficial to these big bankers, because all the failed banks they just absorbed and became bigger and bigger and bigger. And what we're seeing now with the current banking crisis is much of the same. I would argue that you're going to see these banks collapse. A lot of I'm sure as you've covered on your show, a lot of these banks didn't need to be shut down, like Signature Bank. They were only shut down because they were viewed as pro-crypto. The U.S. is having a regulatory crackdown on the crypto industry, and now they're being folded into other mega banks. It's just consolidation, and it's leading us towards this exact plan that was mapped out in the 70s, a one world economy, essentially.
Unbelievable. Not unbelievable when you see it all coming together like this in the web that you've uncovered here. One of the connections that you write about in this piece is where you point out that JPMorgan, their claims are that Jamie Dimon never really knew what Epstein was up to at all during his time. And as you point out, that makes it very difficult to explain given all of these connections. So their stance is they didn't know. He didn't know anything. He's totally absolved of this.
Yeah, well, it's hard to believe, because the same people that are responsible for Jeffrey Epstein are responsible for Jamie Dimon being the top Wall Street banker in the country. And that's very significant. And, we'll see if this particular case questions him about people like John W. Kessler, his time at Bank One, and the financial circles around Leslie Wexner, because Leslie Wexner was on the board of that bank for a very long time and was actually at one point holding unclaimed funds for this bank that allegedly the state of Ohio couldn't find Bank one of the biggest banks in the state, to return them their unclaimed funds. And Wexner's on the board of the bank, but also can't find Bank One to return their unclaimed funds. And the Limited isn't a bank. It's supposed to be a retail, company. So why are they holding state unclaimed funds? I mean, there's totally a bunch of funny business going on here. And that was in the mid 1990s, not that long before Jamie Dimon took the reins of that particular bank. And as I note in my piece, and I referred to earlier, Bank One was money laundering for Middle East arms sales, including for Iran-Contra. And as I've noted before in my work on the Wexner-Epstein stuff, they were intimately involved in that as well, particularly with their acquisition of the CIA's Air America, or renamed Southern Air Transport, in the mid 1990s, ostensibly to run cargo from the Limited between Columbus and Hong Kong. And this is at the time when Epstein is meeting at the White House with people like Mark Middleton, who were central to this Chinagate scandal, which is the same thing about this illicit tech transfers, but instead of the Soviet Union, it was to China. And you have the CIA airline that was involved in all that stuff before at the center of it, but it's very involved with Wexner's business interests, and Wexner, of course, is very involved in China and has been for a long time. The bulk of his retail industry is based there through his long-standing affiliation from the 70s onward with Mast Industries, which is based in Hong Kong. And he, was lobbying for all sorts of business deals all over the world to benefit China. For example, he was trying to create a joint venture between the limited and Chinese state-run companies in the Golan Heights in what is currently held by Israel, but is actually Syrian territory. And he was meeting with the highest levels of Israeli intelligence and Israeli state officials to make that happen. Another example of private Western capitalist enterprises merging and creating joint ventures with communist state-run enterprises and this technology transfer stuff going on. Why did he need a CIA airline? Because before they teamed up with Southern Air Transport, they tried to get another CIA airline involved called Aero Air, and that didn't work out. And all these, there's hundreds of airlines in the country, but this is the one they wanted right after Iran-Contra. I mean, it's very bizarre. And you have top Iran-Contra co-conspirators being involved in securing that deal between Southern Air Transport and the Limited. People like Alan Fears and Richard Secord intimately involved in that. It's totally crazy. But yeah. I think people really need to understand this history because it's having real effects right now, because we're essentially at the end of the line of this decades-long plan where a network of people tied to intelligence and organized crime have created a transnational web where they've essentially completely any sort of military advantage the United States has ever had in technology, so selling it off to our ostensible adversaries. And at the same time, the politicians in power who themselves, like Joe Biden, have economic ties to these same adversary countries are leading us on a march towards war that, thanks to these efforts over the decades, the U.S. is destined to lose. Yeah. It's madness.
It's absolutely madness, and we're absolutely seeing it. We're running out of ammunition. You have Mark Milley admitting that if we go to war, we have no...
We're sending all our money to Ukraine.
Right.
Or have been.
And we don't have the production capacity. We don't have the recruitment capacity, and we're heading right into World War III with these countries, which is insanity. What do you hope that you, as a journalist, what are you hoping would come from this testimony from Jamie Dimon in this Epstein lawsuit? Is there any specific nugget that if you could ask him a question, you would?
Yeah, ask him about Leslie Wexner and John W. Kessler, because as I noted in my piece, John W. Kessler was intimately involved with all these shady businesses and organized crime connections that resulted that came out of an investigation into the murder in broad daylight of the Limited's tax attorney in 1985. Very involved in very corrupt dealings. And there's a lot of very disturbing financial activity that was taking place at Bank One throughout Kessler's time. And the people that are responsible for Dimon being there is the organized crime-connected Crown family, which, among other things, controls U.S. weapons manufacturer General Dynamics. And then Kessler and the Wexner orbit, he's essentially there. Why are the same people that put him in charge of JPMorgan the same people behind Jeffrey Epstein? And, how would he not have known who Epstein was because of those connections? It seems very difficult to believe that there wouldn't be any sort of connection there, or that Jamie Dimon would have no idea who Epstein was and what was going on. It just doesn't really seem very credible. And I doubt he'll be asked about this deeper background to it. We'll see exactly how far the U.S. Virgin Islands is willing to go.
Yeah, to really push this question. I hope that they'll get deep on this and not, be given 1 or 2 word answers and then move on to the next question. Whitney Webb, I encourage all of you to read her latest piece on her website, unlimitedhangout.com. It's called The Rise of Jamie Dimon. If you want a deeper understanding of all of this and these connections, start there. Read also her 2 great books as well on Jeffrey Epstein and the deep state mafia, which is leading us into World War III right now and absolute destruction. Whitney, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show, as always.
Thanks. My pleasure.
Today's episode is brought to you by Shopify. I love that sound. You know what that sound means. It's the best kind of notification. That's another sale on Shopify, and the moment another business dream becomes a reality. Shopify is the e-commerce platform revolutionizing millions of businesses worldwide. Whether you're selling succulents or stilettos, or your flaky salt or fine art prints, categories to consider: fashion, home, garden, health, and beauty, it doesn't matter. really you can focus on anything and build your e-commerce platform. Shopify covers every sales channel, from an in-person point of sale system to an all-in-one e-commerce platform. It even lets you sell across multiple media marketplaces like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. It's amazing. Now it's time to turn yourself to a serious entrepreneur. Get serious about selling and try Shopify today. Do you know that our Redacted store, redactedstore.com, is entirely built on Shopify? And I get notifications, any issue that there pops up from a customer service perspective, it all shows up. Any sales, all right there. And hey, you can support independent journalism by checking out our store. You can see how beautiful the Shopify experience is by going to our store and get a sampling of it. But anyway, all you need to do if you want to try it right now, sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/redacted. Again, all lowercase, shopify.com/redacted. Go to shopify.com/redacted to take your business to the next level today. Shopify.com/redacted.